This is the Comics Alternative, episode 231, reviews of The Excavation, American Gods #1, and Rat Queens #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, Andy and I are going to look at three recent titles. We're going to begin with Max Andersson's The Excavation. After that, we're going to look at issue #1 of American Gods, originally written by Neil Gaiman, adapted by P. Craig Russell, with art by Scott Hampton. And then after that, we're going to take a gander at Rat Queens #1, Volume 2, by Kurt Wiebe and Owen Gienni. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by their great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some amazing colossal specials. And I'm not referring to Gilbert Gottfried either. Mm-hmm. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover. But many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right. And this month, you can find the main book we're talking about, Excavation, for 35% off through DCB Service, and the most recent issues of Rat Queens and American Gods are both 40% off.
Yes, you can always find great discounts on the books we're discussing on each episode of the Comics Alternative and others at Discount Comic Book Service. Check out their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, if you recall, last week we did a shout out to another podcast that actually shouted us out on their show, Secret Stacks. As fate would have it, over the past week, since we did our last recording, I've heard two other podcasts that mention us in one form or another. Now, I don't have recordings of that, or those mentions, but I just want to thank them nonetheless. The guys who do Comics for Fun and Profit, Kyle and Drew, they made reference to us. I think they were trying to pronounce certain words, and they were fumbling around. And I think Drew made the joke, if we get the two guys on, maybe we can ask them how to pronounce these words.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we've got them snowed, don't we?
Yeah, well, we stumble over everything, so.
That's true. But we also got a shout out from the comic book page, which is primarily hosted by John Mayo. And this was on his February trades show and I can't remember the name of his co-host on that show, but they were talking about libraries, and they specifically mentioned one of the Andys, and of course they're referring to Andy Wolverton because he's a librarian, and they were saying how they've been intending for some time to have that Andy at the Comics Alternative on their show to talk about library-related issues.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah. Now, as our listeners may know, Andy Wolverton has unfortunately taken a break from the Comics Alternative for a while. He's stepped out of his role as co-host of the monthly Young Reader series. But we hope at some point to have him back on the show, filling in on special occasions.
Yeah. I hope Andy's enjoying himself not doing the podcast.
Yeah. Another thing we mentioned last week was, I guess, kind of a call to action. We were asking listeners to let others know on social media that they listen to the Comics Alternative, and to do so by using, for this month, the hashtag TRYPOD, TRYPOD, and then to include our unique hashtag in that posting, Try2Guys, TRY, the number 2, GUIS. And several people have done so since then. So we appreciate that, and continue doing that for the month of March, because this, the Tripod event is just a way to bring awareness to podcasts in March. So let people know that you listen to the Comics Alternative by using those unique hashtags.
Yeah, thanks to those who've been using them, and encourage people to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. And then one more bit of news before we get into this week's reviews. We want to thank one of our avid listeners for mentioning us in one of his blog postings. Sturge Batzakis, who has been listening to us for quite a while, runs a blog called Graphic Novel Resources. And on Thursday, March 9th, the post on that blog was titled, Check Out the Comics Alternative Podcast. And he wrote some really good things about us. He said, I only listen to a handful of podcasts, and the only one I follow about comics and graphic novels is the Comics Alternative Podcast, hosted by the two guys with PhDs, Andy Kunka and Derek Royal. Together, and with input from others, they post reviews, do roundtable discussions focused on various comic topics, visit comic stores, report from comics conventions, and interview comics creators. It is an exceptional podcast, and I highly recommend you check them out. And then he gives a list of what he considers some of our highlights, I guess, over the past, especially couple of years. And among others, these include last year's best of episode that we did in late December, the interview with Drew Friedman, the spotlight that we've done. Actually, we've done 2 spotlights on first, second books, the recent Crime Comics episode, the roundtable on political comics, the interview with Evan Dorkin, and it says all of our interviews with Craig Yo.
Yeah, those are good examples. Good examples to highlight, and thanks to Sturge for doing that. I always see him at Heroes Con every year, so I hope to see him again this year. And I always run into him at that kind of, I don't know, Italian place that we go to a couple times. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, starts with a V. Yeah, and according to Sturge, he eats there every meal. So when he's at Heroes Con, so if we go there, we'll probably run into him. You've never met him, right? Right. Yeah. So the times that I've been to Heroes Con, I just haven't run it. Yeah, please do. Especially after this very kind posting he put up on his Graphic Novels Resources blog. Yeah. One more thing before we get to the books, I just wanted to mention, since we're in the middle of March, that at the end of March 31st and April 1st to be exact, I'll be doing the Sumter Comic Art Symposium once again in Sumter, South Carolina. So if any of our listeners are within earshot of Sumter, South Carolina, and want to come down for a comic show that weekend, you're all invited. We've got a good guest list this year. We've got Sophie Goldstein and Carl Antonowitz and Max Miller Dowdle. All 3 of them will be presenting on March 31st at the University of South Carolina, Sumter. And then for the second day, we've got a larger guest list over at the building called Patriot Hall in Sumter, South Carolina. And that's going to include Jamal Eigel, Jeremy Whitley, Chris Sims and Chad Bowers, Rico Renzi and Chris Brunner, Megan Wilson, and some other creators as well. So it'll be a day that April 1st will be a day full of presentations, signings, and there'll be some dealers there as well. So it's a nice little show. We got some good guests. So I hope people that are in the area want to check it out.
Yeah, definitely do so. I was lucky enough to be able to attend last year, but it was earlier in the month, right?
Yeah. In fact, it would have been, I think right now, it would have been this weekend, the weekend that we're talking about right now, or the weekend where we're talking right now.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I wish I were going to be back in the Carolinas for this one.
Yeah, we'll miss you.
Well, let's get into a discussion of the titles we're going to be looking at this week, and we're going to begin with Max Andersson's The Excavation. This is published by Fantagraphics, and it came out the last part of February. This is how do we describe this? How do we set the context here?
Well, it is a surreal, dream-like nightmare of family relationships. I think that about sums it up. Go ahead.
Yeah. Surreal and dreamlike are definitely two words that you would use to describe The Excavation, especially dreamlike. And in fact, well, the book is made up of 7 separate chapters, and each of them read as if it could have been a dream, in terms of the logic of people interacting or ending up in certain situations or settings, and then what happens in those situations. So it is really unusual. And if you're looking for, let's say, I don't know, any kind of coherent or higher truths with a capital T from this book, you may be a little frustrated. But I mean, I think it's a fun and fascinating read. Now, had you read any of Max Andersson's stuff before this?
No, I hadn't, but I noticed that The Excavation itself has been in process for over 18 years. And I think 5 of the 7 chapters had been published previously. Some by Fantagraphics. Are you familiar with those at all?
Yeah. And, so knowing, and I've read a number of other things from Andersson, so I knew what kind of storytelling to expect, and again, it is this kind of surreal, at times almost absurdist, style of storytelling. And I did know that some of the earlier chapters of The Excavation, the book that we have now, had previously been published. Now, back in, I think it started in around 1999, and it was published annually, I think, for 4 years up until 2003. Andersson had a comic book series with Fantagraphics called Death and Candy. And in fact, Death and Candy are 2 of the characters that Andersson writes about. I mean, they're a collection of characters that he keeps coming back to again and again, like one called Carboy, another one called Death, and then Death's friend Candy. But he had a comic book series for 4 issues called Death and Candy. And in each of those 4 issues, he includes a chapter, the first 4 chapters of The Excavation. Now that would be the chapter, The Excavation, Sightseeing, The Viewers, and The Execution. But then the 5th chapter, The Shooting, I would guess that that's the other one that he had excerpted at some other place. But I don't know where. Do you have a sense of where he may have published that one?
I did look it up, and now I can't remember where it was, but it wasn't. Okay. It was in another. You're right. It was in another book.
Yeah. And so, and the reason why I think it makes sense that those first 5 chapters were published previously elsewhere is because of the borders on the pages of the book version of The Excavation. If you look at the first 5 chapters, you have, in essence, each page is a panel. And the border that bleeds off to the edges of all the pages for these first 5 chapters is made up of various images that really make no sense whatsoever. They're just illustrations. Those fade at the very end of chapter 5. And then for the remaining 2 chapters, the reconstruction and the opening, we don't have those same kind of images. Now, in the original publications in Death and Candy, those first 4 chapters, I went back to look at those issues because I have them. And the way that those chapters were put together is you have 4 panels per page. And so the images that, so to speak, decorate the borders in the book version that we're discussing now, actually connected one to the other, like 4 at a time.
Okay.
So basically what he did was to take each of those 4 panels on each page in the original publication and make it a separate page on his own. So that's why it looks like the borders in these first 5 chapters are kind of bleeding off to the edge.
That's interesting. So, I mean, is one of the things that I thought was notable about this book was that each page is a full page panel. And so the reading experience of having 4 of those panels per page, plus having that border, take on, in a sense, a different form, on the 4 panel page, would make for a different reading experience. And I may have actually then paid more attention to that panel border if I, had been reading it the way it had originally been presented.
Yeah. And, I think it does give you, or it would give you, a different reading experience going from one to the other, because I read those original issues of Death and Candy when they came out in the early 2000s, but it had been a very long time since I'd read them. And for all practical purposes, I forgot, what they were like. And then I read Excavation, the book that we're discussing now. And as I was going through the book, I was amazed at how quickly I was getting through it, but that's because you have basically 1 panel per page. And so after I finished reading the Excavation, the book, I went back to look at the older issues of Death and Candy, and I saw that the first 4 chapters were included in the first 4 issues, the only 4 issues of Death and Candy. And then I was reminded about the layout and how instead of, 1 panel per page, you have 4 per page. I'd completely forgotten about that. And I went back to reread those, and the experience was different because you did get to see the 4 panels within the context, the full page. I think the little doodles, the decorations that in the book are on the border, but in the original comic were not only on the border, but also within the gutters.
Right.
I paid more attention to them in the comic book than I did in the book.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I can imagine that's what my experience would have been, as well. So the Excavation starts out with, a protagonist. He never gets a name in this story, right?
Right. I don't think any of the people are ever named.
Yeah. And he and his girlfriend are going to visit his family home, and he discovers that the home is gone, and it's actually an archaeological site that's digging up his family home. Hence the title Excavation. And then he goes down there and finds that his dad, is, I guess, stitching together pieces of his siblings in some kind of weird Frankenstein thing. And then later he's the dad's glad to see his son because he needs a penis for the current project that he's working on. And the son is, decides he doesn't want to give up his penis, so he detaches it, which he discovers. He didn't notice that before that his penis detaches, and he hides it. So he's like, "Dad, sorry, I lost my penis." Dad's really disappointed then, and he can't use it. And that's where it begins. I don't know how much more to do in terms of summarizing the plot. It diverts into kind of two strands where the son, the main character here, goes off with his family, and then there's another strain,
or his father and his brother.
Yeah, And then his girlfriend ends up going off with now those twins. Is that his mother?
Because when we see his mother in the very first chapter, she's an older woman, right. But then toward the end of that first chapter, she is a younger single girl. But then when we see his mother later, they're two young twins.
Yeah.
Again, it's very dreamlike. It doesn't make sense at all.
Right. And I think it's good to point out too that characters will change appearance quite a bit throughout the book. For example, the girlfriend, I think, loses her hair at one point, and then the twin girl mothers slice off someone's scalp and give her the person's dress as well. So the girlfriend has new hair and new clothes, and so on. So there's a lot of that sort of lot of appearance changing going on as well. And at one point, the main character also gets his face caved in with an axe. Spoiler alert. And then right before, right before that, when the protagonist and his father and brother are in kind of a prison-like area, dream prison, this is when the protagonist the younger son starts to look really old. And so at this point, it's almost it's a little more difficult to distinguish him from his father, but you can because the father has a long beard still, but the protagonist still looks older. Right.
So again, things don't seem to make sense.
Yeah. I don't know how much more to say about the plot other than that.
Yeah. Yeah, other than it's strange and it adheres to dream logic.
Yeah, exactly. Now, speaking of that, though, I feel like it may be a kind of occupational hazard of doing this podcast in the first place. That I feel like we read a lot of stuff that has this kind of nightmarish dream logic quality to it. It seems to be a style that comes up a lot in contemporary alternative comics. Even just looking at, say, for example, the stuff that ends up in America's Best Comics every year. A lot of that stuff fits in this, or, Michael DeForge, and others that kind of operate in that register. So when I read this, I was really kind of, I don't know, like, oh no, not another one of these things as I was reading it.
Yeah. We do tend to read works that are hard to encapsulate in a fairly straightforward way. I mean, whether they be dreamlike works or absurdist works, and I think Michael DeForge is a good example of that. Trying to describe what happens in a Michael DeForge comic is sometimes almost like an exercise in futility. But it's the story, the plot really is not the point of that. And I would say that to a large degree, that's a way that you can approach the excavation. Even though there is a plot, I mean, there is a story to tease out there. It just doesn't make much sense.
No, it doesn't. I had a hard time kind of thinking about how I wanted to talk about this, because I would not necessarily say it's a pleasurable experience to read The Excavation. And though the subject is family, I was kind of strained to come up with any kind of commentary or message that this might be expressing about family relationships. Other than that, they can be really fucked up, but that's the history of literature right there.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'm the same way. Because when I sat down to take notes for The Excavation for this week's show, I thought, well, what am I going to say about it? It's like, okay, we can set some context talking about some of Andersson's other works, such as his comic book series Death and Candy, his 1993 book Pixie, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes to the excavation, outside of the initial setup and the dreamlike quality of the story, it's not as if we find any major themes or messages to glean from the story. I mean, again, outside of what you've already pointed out, that it deals with family and how messed up, family can be. Another thing maybe we could say about this, I guess, is the fact that in many ways the story, especially up to the end of chapter 6, tends to turn back on itself.
Right.
So there is something about the protagonist that happens toward the end that you've already mentioned that it starts to make sense given what happens early in the story in chapter 2, when they find under the table of the protagonist's apartment a dead body and the state that dead body is in. And then this is what initially sets off the two main storylines, where the protagonist and his father and brother go one way initially with this dead body, or purportedly with a dead body, and then the protagonist's girlfriend and mother, who are actually two young girl twins, go off on another adventure. But it's with this purportedly dead body that things begin to start turning back on itself. The story does. And also the television that the characters find at some point is a part of this as well. Other than that, though, that in the family situation, I'd be hard pressed to come up with, not only any thematic links to ferret out, but even visual ones. I mean, I would think that with this being such a dreamlike narrative, that there would be, kind of like in dreams, certain images that would be recurring over and over again in one form or another, something like a leitmotif. But you really don't see that, or at least I didn't notice it in the excavation. Did you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with that, and actually, that sort of leads me to wonder if. One of the questions that came up for me while reading is this a wholly successful work? And I guess it depends on what one wants out of something like this. I mean, if one kind of wants to go along for this ride, kind of flowing through the dream logic and the nightmarish imagery that Andersson has created here, that's one thing. And I think a lot of the publicity for this book says stuff like, for fans of Eraserhead, for example. But I think in Eraserhead, you can even draw bigger themes and meanings and messages from that than I think you can do from Excavation, especially on the subject of family. So, I think it really defies evaluation in terms of what is it that we kind of expect from any kind of work of literature or art that we experience. It's an unpleasant experience to go through it. That may be part of the point, to kind of experience this as if one's reading a dream. And a really bad dream. But if one goes into it looking for some bigger message or commentary on family relationships or anything like that, I think that'll be missing. Yeah.
I'm wondering if part of the problem, or I say problem, what we've been talking about in terms of its lack of coherence, is a function of how this book actually started, and that is as a serial.
Right.
Right. So the first 5 chapters were all published previously in other outlets, right? The first 4 being in the 4 issues of Death and Candy that he put out, and then, the 5th somewhere else. I think almost any one of these kind of stands on its own in that it doesn't necessarily need to link to what we saw in a previous chapter to some degree, I think. And if Andersson was writing these earlier chapters of what's become now the Excavation in a serial format, then I think the need to, or at least an awareness of a tighter narrative cohesion between segments may not have been there. And I'm saying that in light of another book that was generated, or at least was originally generated from the first part of his Death and Candy series, and that is Bosnian Flat Dog. So that was, most of it was serialized in issues of Death and Candy, and it also has kind of a disjointed feel to it, although it's much less dreamlike. And I think for that reason, the story in the serialized segments that originally appeared in Death and Candy tend to be a little more tightly woven. I mean, definitely not tightly woven, but more so than we find in Excavation. But I am wondering if maybe the serialization is a part of what we're experiencing, that this is kind of instead of a whole work where things work together in a more tight manner, it's really loose.
That's interesting, because I wonder what it would be like to try to experience this work then as a collection of short stories. I mean, I think that it feels like you need that opening chapter at least to know, what the relationships between some of these characters are, even if those characters' appearance changes later in the book.
Right.
But I don't know. So I'd be curious to, hear more from others too who may have read it in Death and Candy, or may have even picked up random issues of Death and Candy and not read this as a serial narrative.
Right. Now, you said a little while ago that your experience reading this wasn't enjoyable.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, was it, did you dislike it? Was it painful? Was it, do you feel so about it? What?
Oh, well, like I said, I feel like it defies evaluation, and I guess it kind of challenges the way I read. So yeah, when I was reading it, I found myself saying, I don't enjoy reading this book one bit, but I don't, I can't say that's a fault of the book, because, that may not be the point. Not every work is, I don't require all of my literature or art to be enjoyable. I don't mind being disturbed. But so it challenged me, so it made me, kind of ask, what's the point? How much of my reaction to this is my own kind of personal response versus maybe a more kind of something closer to an objective critical evaluation of the work. Because I hate to rely on things like, say, well, it's just not for me, I guess, because I like to have an open mind about the stuff I read, especially, because we read such a variety of diverse things for this podcast. I like that the podcast has opened my experience up to things that I may not have read before, or may not even have enjoyed before. That being said, I think part of what my, again, idiosyncratic response to this was that, man, I've read a lot of stuff like this already that does this sort of thing. And when I got to the point, one of the reasons I brought up the detachable penis thing was that when I got to that, I'm like, yep, there it is. there's a detachable penis in this book. Not to say that you've seen one detachable penis, you've seen them all, yeah. but that
we've seen that in Blubber many times.
Yeah, and Blubber does it so much better. Yeah, that should be a blurb on the back cover of Blubber. Blubber has the best detachable penises in comics. But it felt like there were, so when I I was, kind of trying to find some kind of, I don't know, kind of meaning or something in it, it led me to wonder if the fact that there isn't is because Andersson kind of takes an easy way through this. And that easy way is to kind of do these things that are kind of shocking and edgy, but not, but by not tying them into something larger or more significant, they don't seem to serve a purpose for me other than to shock. And I've been shocked. I've been hit by these things before. This is not my first detachable penis rodeo.
Okay, I think we have a subtitle of this episode. This is not my first detachable penis rodeo. Well, it's interesting because I asked you about your experience and lack of enjoyment in reading this book. Because, I enjoyed it, but I think part of my enjoyment came from the fact that I knew what I was getting into, right. And I like Max Andersson's work. So I was just glad that we have a new book by Max Andersson, and because it's been a little over 10 years since his last book, which was Bosnian Flat Dog. Now, like I said, the early part of that especially was originally serialized in the Death and Candy 4-issue series. But the book came out from Fantagraphics in 2006. And by the way, Andersson did that book with Lars Sunchen, Sjunnesson. So it's been just a tad over 10 years since we've gotten a book from Max Andersson. So I was glad that we got this one, and I knew what to expect. And when I first started reading it and vaguely remembered this earlier story, serialized in Death and Candy, I thought, oh, okay. And then I just sat back and enjoyed the dream, basically. And that's how I was experiencing this book, in looking at it as a dreamlike narrative where I didn't need to make sense of things, but I should just strap in and enjoy the ride. And I did. Yeah,
I think that makes sense, and I find it hard for me to say that, well, first of all, in looking up information on it, seeing that this book has been in the works for 18 years, that does, that does mean that me comparing it to things that have come out more recently isn't necessarily a fair comparison, because those earlier chapters especially precede the things that I'm talking about. That being said, kind of reading this book in, my current situation, I guess, as a reader, and having this come new to me, I had that kind of reflecting on the other stuff we've read more recently that follows this kind of dream logic narrative structure, and found it not as enjoyable as those works were.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that Max Andersson, and he's Swedish, he's right. Also a filmmaker, and I'm wondering if one of the reasons why we haven't gotten much from him over the past several years is because he's doing more work in film.
Yeah.
Because he used to be in a number of anthologies, especially the kind that Fantagraphics would put out. Because for a while, he was, when it was going on, the anthology series 00, he was in a number of issues of that. And he was also in, I guess, Hotwire. But I haven't seen anything from him in a very long time. That's why I was surprised and pleased when I saw this new book.
Mm-hmm.
So if we see another book by him over the next couple of years, are you going to be inclined to read it, you think, or not?
Probably not, but, Fantagraphics sent this book to us for free, so
yeah,
I would feel obligated.
Yeah. I would have read it regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to move on to the next title that we're looking at for this week?
Yeah.
Okay. American Gods, issue number 1. Now, this is based on the Neil Gaiman novel, very popular, which I think when we mentioned this in a preview show a couple of months ago, neither of us have read American Gods, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So both of us are coming to American Gods for the first time through this, the comics adaptation. This is, I guess, adapted and laid out by P. Craig Russell with the art by Scott Hampton, and coming out from Dark Horse. And this first issue will be available in your comic shop the day that this episode goes up, and that is March the 15th.
Yeah. So, so neither of us has read the book, and I had to double check to see if this was, this is an adaptation of the novel, or if it is or if it's a new series just based on the characters from the novel, but it is an adaptation.
Yeah.
And because one of the things that tripped me up is that it gets called American Gods Shadows.
Okay.
As a separate, as a kind of subtitle. So I didn't know if that was something different from American Gods, but it's not. So those readers who may not, may have read American Gods and are wondering what's up with this comic. And so it's an adaptation.
Now, I can't remember. Was it solicited as American Gods Shadows? It shows up on Dark Horse's website that way. Yeah, but I think, and I don't have that copy of previews next to me as I thought I did.
Right.
But I think it was solicited as just American Gods number 1. Yeah. But I tell you what threw me, you're right that subtitle Shadows on the Dark Horse website did get me wondering, like, is this a spinoff of some way of American Gods? Another thing that made me wonder is on the publication page, we get a brief synopsis. I'll just read it because it's not long at all. Shadow Moon just got out of jail only to discover his wife is dead. Defeated, broke, and uncertain where to go from here, he meets the mysterious Mr. Wednesday, who employs him to serve as his bodyguard, thrusting Shadow into a deadly world of the supernatural where ghosts of the past come back from the dead, and a brewing war between old and new gods hits a boiling point. Okay, when I first read that, as soon as you open this issue, that's what you see. I thought, maybe this is what happened previously, and so it picks up from where the novel left off, or at least it goes into a slightly different direction. But that's not the case, because with the first page of real comic, if we get the beginning of what that brief synopsis started to lay out, that Shadow Moon is about to get out of jail, yada yada yada, and so that brief synopsis at the very beginning threw me because I didn't know what to expect. But then that made me wonder, why include that synopsis on the copyright page?
Yeah, because it summarizes the issue that we're about to read and then some.
And then some.
Because we don't even know at the end of this issue what Mr. Wednesday wants of Shadow.
Right. Oh. And I'm wondering if this was something overlooked in editing, because, if I were editor and saw this synopsis on the very first page, first off, even if it just limited itself to what's in this first issue, I would ask the question that you and I are in essence asking, why include this? But an even bigger no-no is that in this synopsis, there's information that doesn't come out in the comic proper. This first issue.
Right.
So it functions almost as a spoiler.
Yeah, it really does, because that is, it is meant to be a kind of emotional gut punch in the book when Shadow is about to get out of jail and finds out that his wife is dead.
Right.
And so, that I had issues with the presence of that too, because I went into the book reading like thinking, oh, this is the things that happened beforehand.
Right.
These are the things that, in the novel would have happened first, and then Russell has decided to start his story in a different place than where the novel begins. But, of course, that's not the case.
Yeah. Now, it sounds as if Andy and I are engaging in spoilers, right? Talking about the wife that dies. Mm. But no, I mean, this information is right there in the first sentence on the very first page.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you take out that synopsis on page 1, on the copyright page, if you take that out of the equation, what did you think of this first issue?
One of the things that, I think, first of all, I think the art is beautiful. I think Scott Hampton working from P. Craig Russell's layouts, is just really, really nice art. And then we get some straight P. Craig Russell art at the end of the book in the last few pages when we're introduced to a new character. Even though it's not credited that way, I don't think, it's pretty clear when we get to, the dark red room, that's Russell's art and not Hampton's.
Right. And I wonder why that information is not apparent on the copyright page.
Right. So anyway, I love the art straight through. I feel like at the beginning, at least, in what is basically, the time, for example, that Shadow's in prison, it is really, really narration heavy. And then so it feels like it's adapted from a prose work. It has a lot of the, I don't know what you would call it, a lot of the problems that, or a lot of the kind of text heaviness that can often come about when someone's adapting a novel into the comics medium.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have paid as much attention to that part of this first issue if I didn't know that this was based on or adapted from, a prose novel,
right,
from Neil Gaiman. I think that if you take out the reality that, this is based on, the prose novel from Gaiman, I don't have as much of a problem with that narration, third person narration that is detached from the life that we see unfolding of Shadow within the panels. I like that kind of distinction between a detached, objective narrator and then the highly focalized experiences of what Shadow's going through within the panels themselves.
Right.
I like that. Although knowing that this is adapted from the Neil Gaiman novel, I kept finding myself thinking, wow, this is really novelistic. You can tell this is based on the novel.
Right.
But even then, I thought that with all of this, I was pleased with this first issue of American Gods. I think that it did a great job of setting everything up. Again, outside of that spoiler synopsis on the copyright page, and then that shift over the last few pages into what seems to be another story, but I'm sure that pretty soon this will link up to the main story that we get with Shadow, the dark red room section. I found that was intriguing as well. Now, again, I've never read American Gods, and so I wonder what my experience would be in reading this first issue, if it would be as positive if I knew the novel. Yeah,
that's a good point. One of the things, I think there's a moment where I thought that Russell and Hampton really did a great job of turning this into a comic, and I'd like to see what the corresponding portion of the novel is, but it's when Shadow is on the phone with his wife, and we get her end of the dialogue. Since he can't see her, we're getting what his imagination of her is, and this is about on page 9 and 10 in the PDF that we're looking at. So
right,
probably about page 7 or 8 in the comic proper. So she's in like a kind of nature setting, wearing a blue dress. She's on pontoon in a bikini, and then she's in a grassy field on a hill in a different dress, all through the same conversation. That is something you can, like, I mean, I guess you could do that in a movie or something, but that's something that works well in the comic. So I thought that was an effective moment that works well comic wise.
Yeah, I wonder how that section is handled in the novel,
Right.
because something like this could be done in prose, but not near as effectively as in the
Exactly.
visual modes of storytelling. I like that section as well.
Yeah, and so basically the setup that we're getting is that Shadow has been released from prison, and Mr. Wednesday, this mysterious Mr. Wednesday, is trying to offer him a job, and he's resistant.
Right.
And then and something is coming. We don't know what it is yet, unless we read that opening. but something's coming, and then we do get this separate narrative with the Dark Red Room that is really, really erotic. And again, that's one of the things that I love about P. Craig Russell's art is it's so sensual, even when he's doing, like his opera adaptations or other works like that, or his Oscar Wilde, I think, work that he did is really, as fairy tales, those are really, really beautiful. And I think this really showcases what his art can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned that we know something is about to happen or is going to happen. And this is set up even toward the very beginning when we learn that Shadow, he's about to get out of jail, but the closer he gets to his release date, the more apprehensive he gets. He just has this feeling, kind of like, maybe an animal or like a dog would right before a storm comes up, that something's happening or is about to happen. And people even come up and tell him, some of his fellow inmates, that something's about to happen. And then when he's on the plane going back to his home, Eagle Point, after he learns that his wife is died in a car accident, I think it's right after he first meets Mr. Wednesday on the plane, he falls asleep and he has this dream with, I guess, the Minotaur. I guess this is the same Minotaur that's on the front cover of issue number 1 that Glenn Fabry does an excellent job with. I mean, it's a beautiful cover. But I don't know what to make of this yet, never having read the book. So I'm wondering if the significance of this Minotaur will become more pronounced in the next few issues. I mean, maybe this Minotaur is a major character. I don't know.
Yeah, I would assume it is, but yeah.
Yeah.
I feel negligent for not having read the book because I've had the book for years. I've just never read it. And I don't know. It got to be one of those things where, I feel like this is a terrible attitude that I get where so many people raved about it, and told me they loved it, and I just like, oh, well, it can't be that good then. But what surprises me is that I still to this day have, like, it's not a lot of students, but every year or so I have a couple students tell me that they are reading American Gods, or they've read it, or it's their favorite book, and I'll say, oh, did you know Neil Gaiman writes comics? And they had no idea. And so for a lot of it, I think it's a really interesting cultural phenomenon that for a lot of readers, especially a lot of young readers, American Gods has kind of been, since it came out, a kind of hip book to read. And I can think of things that were like that when we were in college and stuff. I remember, for example, at least at my school, Catherine Dunn's novel Geek Love was one that, everybody was passing around and stuff. Kind of in similar lines too, as a cult novel. So I like it that phenomenon exists. I think reading this comic makes me want to read the novel. I'm curious also about the TV series, though I doubt I'll get a chance to see it because I think it's on Stars?
Is Stars, have they started it yet?
But I think that's the network it's on, right?
Right.
And I
don't know. Yeah. And I'm sure we don't either. I don't even know if we do. But.
Yeah.
But has the series started on whatever network?
I don't know. I don't think so.
I'll look that up. Yeah, it's interesting that you had this experience with your students, or you occasionally have this experience with your students, that they know Neil Gaiman through other means, but they like, for instance, his prose, but they don't know that he's a comics artist. I had that same thing happen just recently, and I can't remember the details, but the context was Coraline. And I happened to mention I was either in class to an entire group or to just like 2 or 3 select students. We were talking about this, and I mentioned Coraline and Neil Gaiman, and I said something about him being a comics creator, and they said, he is? And I was surprised, like, yeah, you don't know that? But they know him primarily through the book, or maybe even in this case, the film.
Yeah.
But they didn't really know that he did anything in comics, and so I said, okay, first and foremost, check out Sandman from the 1990s. Yeah,
definitely. So yeah, in looking it up, the series begins on Stars on April 30th. So
okay, so next month.
Yeah, so this comic will be about, I guess, 2 issues in by the time that the series starts on TV. I think it's interesting that the TV series has Ian McShane playing Mr. Wednesday. And to, I guess, the credit of Scott Hampton and P. Craig Russell, they did not use Ian McShane as the model for Mr. Wednesday in the book or in the comic.
Right.
One of the other things I read about the book, now I didn't know this in advance, is that the character Shadow is meant to have kind of an indeterminate racial background. And some characters comment on that in this first issue.
Yeah, they do. Because when you first see him, he does look African American, maybe lighter skinned African American, but he seems to be African American. And there were a couple of places in this first issue where someone mentions something about like not knowing his ethnic or racial background. And I thought, that's interesting. But then I went back to look at some of these earlier images of Shadow, and that does seem to be the case. For instance, I'm looking at the bottom panel on the very first page of comic where he is looking through what looks like an opening in a cell wall. And is he black? Is he white? It's very difficult to tell from this one panel.
I didn't think it was necessarily that difficult, but so I mean, I think that they could have done something with that. But it's very interesting when we see him in prison standing next to characters who are kind of unequivocally African American,
right?
And they're depicted with a much darker skin. In fact, with a kind of blue reflection on their skin to, I guess, contrast with Shadow. I think that's an interesting way that they have to, that the creators here had to do that to distinguish him. Because at first I looked at that and I thought, this is one of the few occasions I've ever seen in a comic where the kind of varieties of skin tone with African American characters is being used. Normally everybody just has the same kind of defining skin tone, racially defining skin tone. But then it turns out that that's meant to set Shadow off from the others.
Yeah. And, he has, there's a fellow inmate who is the one that you've referenced who is very dark and he has that kind of blue tint to him. And then we have the warden who is darker than Shadow, but not as dark as that fellow inmate.
Yeah. Good point.
Yep. I like this first issue and I want to go on with the series, but I don't know if I'm going to read this on a monthly basis or just wait until it's collected or the beginning when the first volume's collected. Well, you want to look at the final title that we're looking at this week, Rat Queens #1.
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
Yes. Now, this is Rat Queens #1, Volume 2.
Right.
For those who didn't know already, and I find it difficult that, comics fans may not know that this was already a comic, that Rat Queens ran for 16 issues, and I think issue number 16 came out in April of last year. And then there was one one-shot issue of Rat Queens on the character Braga.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we've had of Rat Queens until now. And this issue, this Volume 2, #1, came out on March 1st.
Mm-hmm.
But we have, still Curtis J. Wiebe is the writer, as with the original Rat Queens. But now we get an entirely different artist, Owen Gieni. Ron Upchurch was the original artist on Rat Queens, and I think his contribution went up to around issue 8 or so, if I remember correctly. And then for, 2 or 3 issues, there was Stepan Sajic, and then for the last run of the first volume was Tess Fowler.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so here we have the same author, but the fourth artist on Rat Queens. Right.
Yeah, I think the art is really good now. I've liked the art all along on Rat Queens, but this I think the new artist here, Owen Gieni, is really handles the characters in the milieu well.
Yeah, I think so as well. I really like this, and in fact, there are parts. Or at times, there is some of Gieni's illustration that definitely reminds me of Upchurch.
Yeah.
And I have, if we're looking at just art alone, just art, I guess I have a preference for Upchurch's art in Rat Queens, just because that's how I originally got to know Rat Queens. And how much of Rat Queens had you read before this new #1 issue?
Just the first trade.
Okay. Yeah, I read, I think probably up to about issue number 7 or 8. And then after that, I just let it lapse. Not because I didn't enjoy it or, any other reasons. It's just lack of time, which is usually the case with me. But I really did enjoy the first volume of Rat Queens. And I like this first issue of the new volume. In fact, the only thing I don't like about this new #1 issue is the fact that it is a new #1 issue.
So you would rather it be issue 17 or so?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. I don't mind actually the move to something like, I guess, seasons for comics instead of like sequential numbering. That doesn't bother me that much.
I don't have an inherent problem with seasons either. What I have an aversion to is a lack of consistency within the medium, right? So, when we have a title like, Dark Horse does a lot of this, right? Hellboy is a great example. Hellboy, each issue has a number, but for all practical purposes, the way that things are released, the way things are titled, is by either, the miniseries or through something like seasons. And being more or less consistent in the way they do that, I think that's fine. When we get to practices by DC and then especially Marvel, it's almost as if anything goes, right? That the numbering scheme is all over the place. Sometimes it seems more seasonal. Sometimes they're just revamping. And do you call a new volume a new season? They're not the exact same things. Season means certain things, even outside of the context of television. And I think that comics as a whole is still, because a lot of people keep mentioning, the season model. I think that different people have a different understanding in comics of what a season might be. And I think within comics as a whole, the medium is still trying to feel its way around there, right? And it just seems very messy to me. I don't have anything against a season or additional new volumes. It's just I don't have anything against continuous numbering. So why not be less confusing and go with the continuous numbering? And of course, I know why they don't do that is because now people are much more apt to buy a number 1 issue than they are a number 17 issue.
Right. And I think the economics of these series being what they are, I would rather see Rat Queens continue. And if the way Rat Queens or any other series continues is to, to be economically viable for the creators, is to have a new number 1 every once in a while, then I'll accept that. It may be different for when DC and Marvel do it, but when it's an independent comic like this, I would rather see, I would rather see more Rat Queens. And if that means every, year and a half or so, I get a new number 1, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And, I don't know much of the context or the backstory surrounding the gap of, I guess about 11 months between issue number 16 of Rat Queens and then this new number 1 from volume 2. Do you know anything about what caused the delay?
No, that's a good question.
Because I'm wondering if it wasn't a matter of the delay, then I would say less of a need to renumber with a second volume, right? Because it would have been relatively fresh in everyone's mind, even if you're going with a different artist, right? Going from Tess Fowler to Owen Gienny. But I think maybe because so much time had passed between the last issue of Rat Queens in April of 2016 and the plans for this next one, then maybe it was advantageous for them just to, renumber with a second volume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, one of the things I went looking into this as a new number 1 is, could somebody who hadn't read Rat Queens before jump in with this number 1?
Yes, good question.
And I think it is entirely successful in doing that. I mean, I think the only thing that may have been a little bit I don't know, referential to earlier stories is when we get Gerard and showing up and Hannah. Or excuse me, not Hannah. God, I can never keep these characters' names straight. The one with the red hair.
Violet.
Violet, yeah. When she, when she says something about how he had been, he's Hannah's father, right? Gerard is Hannah's father, and then he was rescued from another, rescued from a magic prison or something.
Mm-hmm. Right. And not having read those last issues of the first volume of Rat Queens, I did feel though that I was missing out a little bit on something. I agree with you that someone brand new to Rat Queens could pick up this first issue and I guess, overall get a sense that it's a good starting point. I do think though that there are some things that they'll be missing out of, but that's going to be natural because I did feel that what had happened in the previous issues, not having read them, I may have been losing out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like the context of her father, because in that first volume, there's a mentioning of Hannah's father like 2 or 3 times, but we never see him. And so I'm assuming that in the, let's say the third volume, especially of Rat Queens, the collected trade, that he does make an appearance.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a safe assumption. I'm okay with that. I think for everything else, just opening it with Violet waking up from having gotten extraordinarily drunk at a party. And I'm glad to see even in this world they have red Solo cups, it looks like, that they drink out of. But anyway, that we get the characters established. I mean, I think that's the big important thing, is that if somebody is going to come to this new, are they going to understand who these characters are and what their relationships are to one another? And I think they do. I think it also helps then that part of the plot of this is that they run into a male version of themselves.
Right.
And that helps. So if you weren't familiar with what, say, one of the characters' roles or powers or personality was, well, we get introduced to a male counterpart with similar powers or similar personality.
Right, and the leader of this, I guess, male version of the Rat Queens, and what do they call themselves? The Cat Kings? Yeah, is Violet's brother, Barry, right, and we do see Barry in the first volume, obviously, of Rat Queens. He has quite a prominent role in that first volume especially. So, I enjoyed that, and I agree with you in that someone who's never read anything previous to this can get a really good sense of who the characters are. I think it's a good introduction, especially in the fact that, Braga is playing such a prominent role now with the team.
Right.
I think that's important. One thing, though, I wish that this first issue had that the original run definitely had, especially in the early days, and that is a little more cussing.
Yeah.
Maybe Weeby's playing it a little safer here, at least to some degree. But I mean, that's one of the things that caught my attention in that first volume of Rat Queens is not just the free-willing scenarios that they're in terms of sex, drugs, and all of that, but also the language, the exclamations that they make, or the cussing that takes place. I thought it was hilarious, and there's some of that here, but not near the amount as we had in the first run. Yeah.
But I think that overall, someone coming, if any of our listeners have been wondering about, should they be reading Rat Queens, or even if it's been a year since they last read Rat Queens, which it could very well be, I think this is a good introduction or reintroduction to the franchise. And I think that if someone read this and came new to it, I think it would be a good introduction, and they could pick up the rest of the series as it comes out, or if they liked it enough, they could go back and get the previous, whatever it is, 3 volumes, I think, of the collections, and go from there.
In trade form. Yeah. And also this ends on a really good note as well. It involves what looks like a giant goose.
Yeah.
And what happens with Betty, especially, and this giant goose. And then where Betty, I don't want to give away too much detail, but there is one character that we're introduced in the last couple of panels.
Yeah.
Named Milton the Gut Merchant. And he just looks hilarious. And so I can't wait to see what issue number 2 of the new Rat Queens is going to be about.
Yeah. I think it's a nice cliffhanger that makes you want to pick up the next issue and not wait for the trade.
Right. And I'm really pleased with this, I have to say, because you remember back in July of last year, you and I looked at issue number 1 of Bounty.
Yeah.
Which is another Weeby title. And this is one that he was doing, after, at least temporarily, ending or suspending Rat Queens. And I had high hopes for Bounty. I remember not being impressed with that first issue, and I didn't go on to read anything after issue number 1. Did you?
No.
Okay. And I was wondering if, at this point, last summer, if we were going to get any more Rat Queens. Now I'm glad that we are, and I'm especially glad now to see the old Weeby touch that we found in that first Rat Queens is definitely back here. I don't know if it was just the situation of Bounty that didn't work as well for his writing, but I think that with this new number 1 in volume 2 of Rat Queens, we're back to where we were with this kind of hilarious freewheeling kind of style of storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really happy with this first issue.
Yes. So that's it. 3 books this week. We began with Max Anderson's The Excavation. After that, we looked at issue number 1 of American Gods, based on Neil Gaiman's novel, which has been scripted with layouts by P. Craig Russell and art by Scott Hampton. And then we wrapped up with Rat Queens number 1 of the 2nd volume by Curtis Wiebe and art by Owen Gianni. So great reads, definitely something to check out. And I know where our listeners can check out all of these titles and get them at great discounts, and that is at Discount Comic Book Service. Check out dcbservice.com, and right now you will find great discounts on The Excavation and on subsequent issues of both American Gods and Rat Queens, as Andy pointed out at the top of the show. So that's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys at comicsalternative.com. You can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed that you can check out at the number 2guys with PhDs.
That's right, but you can find us elsewhere on social media, such as on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. So look for us there. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing, and find out what we're doing.
And we do like to hear from you, so please get in touch. And remember, for the month of March, tweet us out with the hashtag tripod and hashtag try2guys. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.